2 months had passed in peace and steady routine. On this particular day, Alice mentioned the long-awaited visit of the twin horns. Her tone carried warmth, and Reynolds responded with a soft smile, hinting that everyone in the family shared her excitement. The house felt a bit livelier that morning, filled with quiet anticipation. Arthur wandered through the hallway when a sudden knock echoed from the front door. His pace quickened as he rushed over and opened it, a wide smile forming across his face. The door swung open to reveal familiar figures, and instantly, Arthur was engulfed in a tight embrace, his face pressed against something soft, Angela's chest, reminding him of a suffocating but oddly comforting feeling, one that brought back memories from his early childhood. She wept as she held Arthur, apologizing for not being there to protect him when he needed it most. Her hold was suffocating, and only when someone pointed out that he couldn't breathe did she pull away in panic and embarrassment. As Arthur peeled himself away from her arms, his eyes caught the massive figure of Durden. The once towering man had grown even broader and more imposing. Durden reached out and gently patted Arthur's head. His narrow eyes shimmered with tears, and that single silent gesture broke something inside Arthur. His own tears followed, drawn out by the pure sincerity in Durden's expression. Adam stood beside them, trying to lighten the mood. He jokingly complained about the emotional flood, calling out the others for crying when the plan was to stay cheerful for Arthur's sake. He even pointed to the shadow beast trailing behind Arthur, curious why no one had addressed it. Helen, standing beside Adam, nudged him and dismissed his remarks with a grin. She welcomed Arthur warmly, complimenting how much he had grown and matured. Adam, pretending to stay composed, claimed he was the only one acting like a real adult. Then something unexpected happened. Jasmine stepped forward. She, who had always been distant and emotionally guarded, embraced Arthur tightly. She didn't say much, just pressed her face against him and trembled softly, whispering the same words again and again through her sniffles. Her repeated apologies were faint, but full of pain. The sight of Jasmine crying broke any assumptions about her coldness. Reynolds and Alice stood nearby, realizing they had come in at the wrong moment. They exchanged a quiet glance and chose not to interrupt the reunion. Alice nodded, moved by the emotions unfolding before them. Soon after, the warmth of the reunion faded, and the group began preparing for the day ahead. Outside, Vincent offered to send more conjurers inside the auction house for added security, but Reynolds assured him that they had it covered. Angela and another wind conjurer were already taking turns maintaining detection barriers. Durden was watching over the main entrances. Any more than that, and they risked drawing attention, people might assume something big or even dangerous was about to happen. Vincent expressed his gratitude toward Reynolds with sincerity. The return of the twin horns had become more than just an emotional reunion. It was a vital boost in security and trust. With their presence, Reynolds had been able to shift several guards to outer areas, spreading protection more efficiently. His strategy was to engage any possible threats far from the auction house, ensuring the safety of the guests and preserving the integrity of the building. Although he made the remark lightly, the tension of recent events made even jokes carry weight. Vincent, having experienced the chaos mages could bring firsthand, didn't take Reynolds' words lightly. He responded with a half-hearted laugh, but it was clear he intended to hold Reynolds to that promise if anything went wrong. He then brought up something Arthur had mentioned, his desire to acquire a sword before registering as an adventurer. That surprised Reynolds for a moment. Vincent had assumed Arthur would take after his father's fighting style, which was rooted in hand-to-hand combat using gauntlets. It was unexpected to hear Arthur was interested in swordsmanship. Reynolds explained that his only involvement had been buying Arthur a simple wooden starter sword. Everything else Arthur had learned was self-taught. Reynolds mentioned the boy had started training when he was just 4 years old. Vincent was stunned, yet somehow, knowing Arthur, he wasn't entirely surprised. Then Reynolds added something more unusual. He said that during the rare times he sparred with his son, there were moments when Arthur emitted an eerie pressure, something cold, precise, and experienced. It felt like Arthur had fought many battles before, despite being just a child. It wasn't simply about skill, but a kind of quiet mastery that didn't match his age. Vincent raised an eyebrow. He pointed out the obvious. Arthur hadn't even lived for a full decade. Wasn't Reynolds giving his son a little too much credit? Reynolds admitted it might be true, but there was something else. During sparring, Arthur would sometimes fumble or trip, not like someone inexperienced, but more like someone not used to his own body. There was a strange disconnect, as if his mind moved faster than his limbs. Vincent leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. He suggested it might be early puberty. His tone hinted at sarcasm, but the explanation was left hanging between them. Reynolds gave a resigned look and ended the discussion with a nod. The two men decided to head downstairs, knowing the others were likely waiting. As Reynolds and Vincent walked down the stairs, they were immediately met with the sight of everyone waiting below, fully dressed and ready. The group had all suited up in clean black and white attire, creating a refined and formal atmosphere. Tabitha, already at the bottom, expressed her impatience at how the two men were the last ones ready, despite being adults. Vincent looked around at the group, visibly impressed. Everyone had taken the time to prepare and looked elegant in their outfits. He remarked on the matching colors, admitting that he felt a bit guilty for setting such a strict black and white dress code. Alice, calm and collected as always, reassured him. She was more comfortable in darker tones anyway, and didn't mind the subdued palette. Arthur, standing among the group, felt a quiet realization sink in. Even dressed formally, he still looked like a child. His reflection made him slightly restless. He couldn't wait for the day his body would catch up with his mind, to look less like a cute kid and more like someone others would take seriously. That thought lingered as everyone began making final preparations. Vincent clapped his hands to gather everyone's attention. With a cheerful voice, he encouraged them to head out. The carriages were already waiting outside. As they walked, Vincent placed a proud arm around Arthur's shoulders. He had heard about his daughter's progress and brought it up with hope in his voice. Arthur responded with calm confidence. Lilia's training was going well, and if she stayed on track, she would awaken in time to attend Xyrus Academy at the standard age. Vincent gave a thankful nod in return. Arthur reminded him that he was only fulfilling his side of their agreement. In return, he was looking forward to seeing something impressive at the auction house. Vincent promised not to disappoint. With the introductions out of the way, the entire group, including the Twin Horns, made their way to the Hellstay auction house. It was the venue for the 10th anniversary celebration. Inside the carriage, Arthur spent the time catching the Twin Horns up on everything that had happened since his fall from the cliff. Reynolds had already given them a general summary in his letters, but now they wanted the full story from Arthur himself. Adam, as always, reacted with disbelief. He couldn't imagine the things Arthur had endured after the accident. Helen, more grounded, focused on the bond Arthur had managed to form. She pointed out how rare and special it was, something even seasoned adventurers and nobles couldn't achieve easily. Arthur smiled at that. The bond wasn't just rare, it meant something deeper to him. As the carriage wheels screeched against the stone path, the vehicle came to a steady stop. Tabitha, peeking outside, confirmed that they had reached their destination. One by one, the passengers stepped out. Guards standing at the entrance greeted them with disciplined bows, signaling that everything was in order. Arthur stepped down last and immediately froze in place, struck by the sight in front of him. The Hellstay auction house stood tall and elegant, with a refined exterior carved from white stone and polished glass. The place was buzzing with energy, and just by looking at it, Arthur could feel that this wasn't an ordinary event. This was the 10th anniversary of the Hellstay auction house, an occasion that had drawn attention from nobles, adventurers, and influential figures across the kingdom. More than a celebration, it was a showcase of power and prestige. Priceless artifacts, ancient relics, and powerful beast cores had been held in secure vaults just for this day, and now they were finally on display for a rare chance at ownership. As Arthur scanned the surroundings, his eyes widened at the variety of magical items and cores on exhibit. Some radiated raw energy, others pulsed like a living heartbeat. One item, so strange in appearance that Arthur couldn't even guess what it was, made him pause with curiosity. While the buildings outside was impressive, the inside more than lived up to its reputation. Every wall and fixture gleamed. Speaking of wealth and class, Vincent stepped forward with purpose, rallying the group. With firm words, he reminded everyone of the importance of the day. No mistakes could be allowed. Every detail mattered. Reynolds, shifting into his commander mindset, turned to the guards with clear instructions. He ordered Team B to sweep the side corridors every 30 minutes and return to their original routes, emphasizing the importance of consistent coverage. Arthur quietly observed the coordination and leadership around him. His eyes followed his father as he gave orders with precision. He couldn't help but smile. Seeing Reynolds in his old element, commanding like a true leader, stirred something proud inside him. He turned to Helen, who stood beside him briefly. She acknowledged Arthur's thoughts, explaining that Reynolds had always been a leader. Though she had grown in her own right after taking his place, she still felt she hadn't fully matched what he once was. With a small nod, she excused herself and went to join Reynolds, leaving Arthur behind. Alice called to Arthur, urging him to move inside. Arthur quickly responded, following her closely. She assured him that Vincent and his father would join them later, as they were busy with preparations. As they stepped through the front door, Arthur was immediately taken aback by the grandeur of the interior. The space stretched out before him, an aisle leading all the way to a grand stage at the far end. On either side of the aisle, rows of seats rose higher and higher, capable of holding over 10,000 people in total comfort. Arthur couldn't help but reflect on the sight. Despite having lived as a king and been surrounded by the royal family of Eleanor Kingdom, this was a level of opulence he had rarely encountered. The scale of it was breathtaking. Tabitha, walking alongside Arthur, asked his opinion on the Hellstay auction house. Arthur, still in awe of the vastness before him, commented that calling it a house seemed like an understatement. Tabitha beamed with pride at his reaction, clearly pleased with how much he admired the place. Lilia, with a grin, added that Arthur hadn't seen anything yet. She mentioned the private viewing rooms at the top of the building, where even more exclusive items were displayed. With a nod, Tabitha led the group up to the upper levels. The private viewing rooms were just as impressive as the main hall, designed with elegance and comfort in mind. The furnishings were carefully chosen to reflect the prestige of the event. Arthur's excitement grew as he surveyed the surroundings. Seeing how grand the building was, he couldn't wait to discover the kinds of rare and valuable items that would be up for auction. Tabitha informed everyone that they would be expecting some very special guests soon, but encouraged them to make themselves comfortable for now. Arthur settled into a seat near a large glass window, taking in the bustling scene around him. The auction house was becoming increasingly lively as more guests, likely influential individuals, filled the lower seats, creating an atmosphere of excitement and chatter. As Arthur observed the crowd, a servant approached, apologizing for the interruption, but informing them that the VIP guests had arrived and would be here shortly. Tabitha nodded in acknowledgement, signaling that she understood. Soon after, Vincent stood and proudly announced the arrival of the distinguished guests. His voice filled the room, introducing the royal family, presenting His Majesty King Blaine Glader, Her Majesty Queen Priscilla, Prince Curtis, and Princess Kathleen Glader. Arthur felt an unmistakable sense of awe wash over him. The atmosphere shifted and he could feel the presence of royalty, much like he had in Eleanor. King Blaine spoke first, commenting on the presence of other guests, a slight surprise evident in his tone. Vincent quickly apologized, explaining that he remembered the king's wish to meet his family again. He gestured to his wife, Tabitha, and daughter, Lilia, who both bowed gracefully in respect to the royal family. Vincent then introduced Alice Leywin, his close friend's wife, and their children, Arthur and Eleanor Leywin. The royal family's demeanor shifted to warmth at the mention of Vincent's friends. King Blaine extended a welcoming hand, stating that anyone who was a friend of Vincent was a friend of his as well. The king then instructed everyone to stand, adding that they were there to celebrate the Helsty Auction House's 10th anniversary and enjoy the event. Queen Priscilla, in a more relaxed tone, agreed, encouraging everyone to remain informal and enjoy the evening. She added with a smile that it would be nice to have company besides just the guards. At that moment, a small sound caught everyone's attention. Queen Priscilla's eyes widened with delight as she observed the creature. She remarked on how cute Sylvie was, noting that it seemed reptilian-based, but with an unusual level of intelligence. Arthur introduced Sylvie to the royal family, explaining that she had just hatched a few months ago. He encouraged his mana beast to greet them, and with that, Sylvie let out a soft squeak, as if acknowledging the royal presence. King Blaine was intrigued by the bond between Arthur and Sylvie, asking if this mana beast was Arthur's bond. Arthur confirmed that it was, feeling a surge of pride as he explained the nature of their connection. King Blaine marveled at how fortunate Arthur was to have formed such a bond, especially with an infant mana beast, as they were notoriously difficult to tame. Arthur responded humbly, clarifying that their relationship wasn't one of simple obedience. He explained that they communicated mentally, making it more of a mutual agreement between them. Just then, a voice interrupted, asking in disbelief if Arthur was suggesting that he had entered into an equal contract with his mana beast. Arthur immediately felt a sense of unease, inwardly cursing himself for perhaps saying something strange. He tried to backtrack, stammering that he supposed it could be described that way, but Sylvie had initiated the contract herself. The man who had spoken earlier demanded a closer look at Arthur's bond, but King Blaine quickly intervened, his voice firm and commanding. He reminded the man, Sebastian, that this was neither the time nor place to study someone's pet. The man immediately apologized, bowing deeply to the king. Tabitha, aware of the growing tension, stepped in with a polite but urgent suggestion. She urged the royal family to take their seats, noting that the event was about to begin. With a polite nod, King Blaine and Queen Priscilla moved toward their designated seats, allowing the event to continue. Arthur cast a cold glance at Sebastian, who returned his gaze with an unsettling intensity. The air between them thickened with an unspoken tension as Sebastian dropped his hood, revealing his face, his eyes still locked on Arthur's. The host of the event, sensing the shift in atmosphere, quickly took control of the situation. He addressed the crowd with an enthusiastic tone, welcoming the nobles and adventurers in attendance. He expressed his honor at being there and reminded everyone that the evening was for one purpose: to obtain rare and valuable items at the auction. The crowd responded with excitement, their cheers echoing throughout the grand hall. Before the auction could begin, the host requested that everyone turn toward the south. The crowd shifted in unison as he announced the arrival of another highly esteemed group of guests. The very king and queen of Sapin had arrived, and their presence commanded immediate respect. As the royal couple entered, everyone in the audience bowed in reverence. The host's voice rang out, inviting the crowd to give a round of applause for the man who had made the entire event possible, Vincent Helstia. As the crowd clapped, Arthur couldn't help but feel a twinge of familiarity. He thought back to his past life, a time when he was once a king, but that life felt distant now, and in this body he hadn't even gone through puberty yet. The contrast between his old life and his current one made him feel almost like an outsider in this new world. Arthur's gaze shifted toward Queen Priscilla, observing her closely. He noticed something about her. She was a conjurer. The fact that he couldn't sense her mana meant she was either concealing it with an artifact or her power was at a level so high that even his senses couldn't detect it. It was an intriguing realization for him, especially when he considered how he felt no attraction to her, or any older woman for that matter. Despite her being within the same age range as his mother, he didn't feel the same way he once might have in his previous life. It wasn't that he found younger girls more attractive either, but rather that the thought of dating was far from his mind. He shrugged off the thought. Dating wasn't something he had any plans on pursuing anytime soon. Vincent's voice broke Arthur's chain of thought. He whispered to him, suggesting that Arthur might want to bid on a sword that was currently up for auction. Vincent assured Arthur that the price wouldn't be an issue. As the owner of the auction house, he could afford whatever was needed. The host then introduced the sword being auctioned. A short sword forged by a master blacksmith who was also a fire artificer. The sword's handle was imbued with the core of a mighty thunderhawk, and when infused with a bit of mana, it would generate electricity along the edge of the blade, enhancing its cutting power and even causing paralysis. The bidding would start at 50 gold coins. As the bidding began, Arthur found himself musing about the value of the sword. He considered the cost of living in different regions, reflecting on how a modest house in Xyrus could cost at least a single gold coin. In his hometown of Ashbur, a family could live comfortably on a handful of copper coins a day. The opening bid for the sword alone could sustain a family for over 250 years. The disparity was staggering. Vincent leaned in, eager to hear Arthur's thoughts on the sword. He remarked that while it might be a bit large for Arthur at the moment, a weapon with an elemental ability like this was rare. Arthur considered the offer, but he quickly shook his head. The sword was powerful, no doubt, but it wasn't something he truly needed. Vincent leaned back, clearly expecting Arthur's answer. He already knew what kind of items would catch Arthur's attention, but he quickly assured Arthur that this was just the beginning. Even if nothing from the auction floor appealed to him, Vincent had already managed to secure all the other items Arthur had asked for. Arthur's interest peaked. One item in particular stood out in his mind. He asked about a voice-altering mask. Vincent smiled with pride. He reminded Arthur who he was dealing with. Not only had he found the mask, but he had also gone beyond expectations. Vincent had secured a coat made from the pelt of a nightmare fox. The rare material granted the wearer the ability to obscure their presence, perfect for stealth and evasion. He thought it was exactly what Arthur would want, so he claimed it before anyone else could. Arthur was impressed, even laughing lightly. It was more than he'd hoped for. Vincent, however, reminded him to stay safe. If anything were to happen to Arthur, he would be the one facing Alice and Reynolds. The warning, though spoken lightly, held weight. The auction continued, offering more weapons and even beast cores. Some were of lower grade, C-class, but several rare and powerful A-class cores were also on display. The bidding intensified as nobles raised their bids. Even King Blaine joined in, eventually winning an A-class beast core. But no one would know the true value of the core until the recipient absorbed it. Only then would it be revealed whether it housed a beast will. As the auction dragged on, Arthur felt his body stiffen. He stretched and wondered when the intermission would begin. His eyes scanned the area for his companion. Sylvie had been beside him earlier, but now she was gone. He turned to Lilia, who was seated nearby. She confirmed that Sylvie had been there just moments ago. A sense of unease crept over Arthur. He began searching, calling out for the mana beast. Then he heard it. Her voice. Sylvie's frightened cry called out to him, pulling his attention to a disturbing sight. Sebastian, the royal family's court mage, was trying to capture Sylvie. The man's eyes gleamed with an unsettling greed as he reached for her, calling her like she was some helpless creature for the taking. Sylvie, terrified, had tears forming in her eyes, but she managed to escape his grasp and dashed toward Arthur. Arthur's instincts flared like a firestorm, threatening to break free. Every part of him screamed to act, to protect, but he forced his body to remain calm. He reminded himself of who Sebastian was. No ordinary man, but the royal family's court mage. Acting on impulse could bring more than just trouble. He gently turned to Sylvie and walked away, trying to contain the anger rising within. But before he could take another step, Sebastian's voice cut through the tension like a blade. His tone was coated in arrogance. He mocked Arthur, belittling his background, claiming a commoner from the countryside had no right to be bonded with such a special creature. Arthur stopped. The weight of that insult hung heavy in the air. Sebastian stood there with a smirk. Without shame, he declared that the mana beast, Sylvie, would soon be his. Something inside Arthur snapped. His fists clenched tightly. His blood boiled with silent rage. The air around him shifted, no longer calm. It grew cold and heavy, like a coming storm. His gaze locked onto Sebastian, sharp as steel. His presence alone was enough to make the space around them still. The atmosphere changed. Meanwhile, moments before this tension erupted, Vincent had been deep in thought. He considered Arthur's disappointment with the auction so far. All Arthur wanted was a quality sword. Nothing ornate or flashy, just reliable craftsmanship. Vincent was sure something fitting could be found in their own vaults. courts, tucked away and forgotten by nobles chasing glitter over substance. While he was thinking, King Blaine approached and placed a hand on Vincent's shoulder. The king seemed pleased, commending Vincent for the success of the evening. He was especially impressed by the A-class beast core, taken from a powerful silvercoat bear. Blaine acknowledged the difficulty in acquiring such an item and was satisfied with his purchase, though curious to see if the beast will inside the core remained intact. Vincent replied humbly, assuring the king that he was glad the event lived up to expectations. But Blaine dismissed the humility. He considered the entire event a grand affair and praised it openly. Then everything changed. As they turned their attention back toward the auction stage, an invisible force suddenly pressed down upon the room. It was suffocating, heavy, deadly. A terrifying and oppressive presence swept over them all. The energy was thick and cold, like the crushing depths of the sea. Vincent felt it immediately. His body stiffened. His thoughts screamed for movement, but his limbs would not obey. Panic tried to rise, but even fear was silenced under the weight of that bloodlust. This was supposed to be the safest room in the entire building. The king's guard was stationed inside, and Vincent's own personal guard secured every entrance. Yet none of that mattered now. Vincent's breath turned shallow. Sweat beaded down his face slowly, trembling as if the droplets themselves sensed the danger. Something monstrous had just awakened. Panic spread through the hall like wildfire. The oppressive aura had struck fear into the hearts of even the most seasoned warriors, choking the air with tension. One of the royal guards rushed forward, throwing himself in front of Queen Priscilla. She stood firm, her concern not for herself, but for the children nearby. Her instincts as a mother and a queen took control. Protect the innocent, no matter the cost. King Blaine Alret stepped forward, his hand unsheathing the royal sword with a sharp metallic whisper. His voice thundered across the room, demanding to know who dared threaten the royal family. His eyes scanned the silent hall, but no enemy revealed themselves. All around, nobles and guards alike felt the icy grip of fear clawing at their throats. It was as if death itself hovered above them, waiting to strike. No one could move. The pressure was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Arthur stood in the center of it all, his heart pounded. The weight of the atmosphere mirrored his guilt. The realization hit him. He had lost control. As quickly as it had begun, the oppressive presence faded. The tension thinned. Breath returned to lungs that had forgotten how to function, but confusion lingered. Vincent looked around, dazed. He couldn't understand what had just happened. Then the silence shattered. The doors burst open, crashing against the walls. Reynolds, accompanied by his unit, stormed in. Eyes sharp, posture tense, he immediately scanned the room. The royal guards informed him that the room had already been cleared, but they were still searching the area to ensure complete safety. Reynolds didn't hesitate. He ordered his companions to continue the sweep upstairs. Within moments, a report came in. One of the guards relayed to King Blaine that an intruder had been caught by Captain Leywin. The king, upon hearing this, gave a brief nod. With the supposed intruder now in custody, he was content that the situation was under control. Deep inside, Arthur silently offered a prayer of gratitude. Whoever that intruder was, they had unknowingly taken the fall for his own outburst. Their misfortune had become his shield. Across the room, the tension slowly settled into uneasy chatter. Some of the royal guards tried to lighten the mood. They mocked Sebastian, pointing out how the great court mage had fallen backward like a startled child in the middle of the chaos. They laughed, teasing that he'd die young at this rate. Sebastian, red with embarrassment, barked a denial. He insisted I had only slipped. But his eyes told another story. He glanced at Arthur. Suspicion flickered in his gaze. He stared for a long moment, sensing something but unsure of what. Then, without another word, he turned away in silence, retreating behind a mask of arrogance and disdain. The host thanked the guards for their swift response, then forced himself to regain composure as he brought attention back to the main event. Despite the tension in the air, tradition had to be upheld. The final item was now being presented, and it was custom for the best treasure to be saved for last. As the curtains rose, the hall filled with a fierce echoing roar. Standing at the center of the stage was a young manhwa beast, a world lion cub. The audience gasped in awe at the sight. Its golden fur shimmered under the lights, and even in its infant form, its presence radiated strength. The host explained the significance of the creature. A fully grown world lion held the potential to become a formidable B-class manhwa beast, and if nurtured properly, it could even evolve into an A-class beast. An extraordinary rarity. To own such a creature wasn't just a privilege, it was a chance at power and status. With proper training, the lion's future master could rise to become a legendary beast tamer. The hall buzzed with excitement. Eyes sparkled with greed and ambition. Whispers filled the air as the bidding began at 500 gold coins. Wealthy nobles and prestigious figures joined the fray, raising the stakes higher with each call. The price quickly leaped from 500 to 600, then to 700 gold coins. Then, the bidding came to a sudden halt. A deep, commanding voice rang out through the hall, enhanced by a voice-amplifying artifact. It was King Blaine. His declaration was loud and absolute. The moment the king placed his bid, all others backed down. No one dared to challenge the authority of the throne. The infant world lion would belong to him. Vincent acknowledged that no one would dare bid against their own monarch and extended early congratulations. With a composed tone, he expressed gratitude for King Blaine's generosity, stating that a single white gold tablet was more than a fair price. He then inquired casually about the king's plans for the newly acquired world lion, questioning whether the king intended to tame it himself. King Blaine responded with a thoughtful smile. While the idea of forming a bond with such a powerful mana beast was indeed tempting, he had other intentions. He revealed that he was considering giving the infant lion to his son, Curtis, though he hinted that this gift would depend on the boy's performance. Curtis, standing proudly, promised to do his best. The conversation took a light-hearted turn when Queen Priscilla, unable to resist, teased Curtis about his habit of avoiding his tutor's lessons. The young prince protested, clearly caught off guard, reminding his mother of her promise to keep that secret. Arthur, quietly observing the exchange, felt a small smile form. Watching them interact so naturally made them seem almost like a normal family. Despite the status and power they held, in this moment they were simply parents and a child. Vincent soon reminded everyone that the auction was coming to a close. He politely asked if the king preferred his items to be gathered and delivered later, but King Blaine refused the offer. He declared without hesitation that he had no patience for waiting and would accompany Vincent personally to collect the treasures. With a chuckle, Vincent agreed and prepared to lead the royal group. Before they could leave, Sebastian stepped forward, approaching the king discreetly. He leaned in and whispered something into the king's ear. The content of the message was inaudible to others, but King Blaine's reply was short and firm. He understood. Arthur, standing nearby, watched the interaction closely. An unsettling feeling crept into his chest. Something about it didn't sit right. A few moments later, the group made their way into a more private space where the auctioned items were being prepared. Vincent informed King Blaine that an attendant would soon arrive with the purchases. Then he turned to Arthur. Vincent handed over a bundle to the boy. Everything Arthur had requested except one item, the sword. For that, Vincent suggested that Arthur take a walk through the collection and find one that suited him personally. Alice, ever supportive, stepped in with a warm gesture. She took the bundle and gave her son a reassuring wink, offering to hold everything while he searched for a sword. Arthur gave a small nod of appreciation. King Blaine observed him with mild curiosity and asked if Arthur was planning to take up sword lessons, mentioning that his own son Curtis had just begun training. The king even proposed the idea of a friendly sparring match between the two boys someday. Before the thought could settle, Sebastian immediately stepped in. His words were sharp and dismissive. He claimed that Prince Curtis could only pick up bad habits if he sparred with commoners. Arthur responded humbly. He bowed his head and insisted that swordsmanship was only a hobby for him. He claimed he could never match someone of Curtis's level. At that moment, Reynolds finally arrived, his presence breaking the tension. With a relieved tone, he greeted Vincent, and the older man waved him over quickly, informing him that the king wanted to meet him. Reynolds bowed deeply to King Blaine, offering an apology for the intrusion, but the king quickly dismissed the formality. He had already heard about the intruder incident and was pleased with Reynolds' involvement. He praised him openly, remarking that Vincent had found a capable man to rely on. Reynolds, ever modest, downplayed the compliment and said he was only fulfilling his duty. King Blaine acknowledged him by name and then glanced toward Arthur, confirming that the boy was his son. Reynolds responded respectfully, but there was a hint of concern in his voice. Then came the real reason for the attention. The king explained that Sebastian had served the royal family for many years, providing loyal service that had benefited the kingdom countless times. As a token of appreciation, the king believed that rewarding Sebastian was just and necessary. It so happened, the king noted, that Sebastian had taken a special interest in Arthur's mana beast. According to the king, offering the bond to a royal guard would be considered a noble service to the kingdom. Reynolds stood still, the weight of the request landing heavily on his shoulders. He tried to respond with restraint, but it was difficult to keep the edge out of his voice. He respectfully explained that the mana beast was not something he or his wife had gifted their son. It was a bond Arthur had formed on his own. As such, it wasn't their place to give it away or speak for him. King Blaine fell silent for a moment. His gaze slowly shifted from Reynolds to Arthur. The air grew tense as he turned to face the boy directly, but Arthur didn't waver. He stood still, calm, returning the king's stare without blinking. There was no fear, no hesitation, only quiet defiance. Sebastian was clearly irritated by Arthur's reaction. He raised his voice, berating Arthur for not lowering his gaze while standing before a superior. His tone was harsh, meant to intimidate, but before he could continue, King Blaine lifted a hand and stopped him. The room stilled again. The king then shifted his attention directly to Arthur. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed the child. There was no need to repeat what had just been discussed with Reynolds. Instead, he extended a generous offer. The royal armory, filled with treasures and legendary weapons, would certainly hold a sword worthy of any young aspiring knight. Arthur took a a moment to steady his breath. He reminded himself that he was standing before a king, someone powerful enough to end his family's peace with a single word. Still, he held his ground. With a respectful bow, Arthur declined the offer. He thanked King Blaine for the honor, but made it clear that no sword, no matter how magnificent, could ever replace Sylvie, his bond. Sebastian immediately erupted, his temper snapping at what he saw as insolence. But before his words could land, King Blaine shut him down again. The king's patience, however, was clearly being tested. In an attempt to compromise, Blaine made another offer. This time, he proposed a trade. His newly acquired world lion cub, a powerful mana beast with great potential, in exchange for Sylvie. But as soon as the words left his mouth, his son Curtis protested. The world lion was supposed to be his. The king dismissed Curtis's outburst, keeping his attention fixed on Arthur. Blaine tried to reason with him. He acknowledged Sylvie's uniqueness, but argued that reptilian mana beasts rarely reach the strength of true predators like the world lion. He spoke as a ruler, offering logic and opportunity, not fully grasping the bond that tied Arthur and Sylvie together. Arthur once again refused. Calmly but firmly, he apologized if his words had not been clear before. He had no intention to give, sell, or trade Sylvie under any circumstance. The king's voice sharpened. He reminded Arthur that this was now the third time he had asked. Twice he had already shown patience, but even a king's tolerance had its limit. His tone carried weight, and his words were heavy with finality. He warned Arthur that this would be the last time he asked, one final opportunity to hand over the bond willingly. But Arthur didn't cower. Instead, he looked up and, with a cold and composed expression, asked to pose a question in return. Then came the words that would stop the room dead. Arthur asked the king how much he would be willing to sell his children for. He didn't raise his voice or waver. He simply made the point clear. This was not about a beast. It was about a bond deeper than ownership. 3 times Arthur had refused. 3 times the king had pressed on. Arthur accused him of pride, unable to accept rejection. And now, to reflect the weight of the demand, he asked the king how much money it would take to give up his own son or daughter. The hall went silent. Not a breath moved. Everyone was frozen, wide-eyed, and stunned. No one could believe what they had just heard. Just then, one of the royal guards, blinded by rage and loyalty, lunged forward with his sword raised high. The guard had focused all of his energy into that strike, determined to punish what he perceived as an unforgivable insult to the king and the royal family. Time slowed for Arthur. His senses sharpened as mana surged calmly through his veins. He focused, controlling the flow of energy in his body. He read the guard's movement, every muscle, every shift of balance. He didn't panic. Instead, he waited. He aligned his stance to intercept the strike, not with brute strength, but by turning the enemy's momentum against him. As the blade rushed toward him, Arthur sidestepped with precise timing. The sword barely missed him. In that instant, Arthur reached out, grabbed the guard's wrist mid-swing, and then delivered a devastating uppercut directly under the man's chin. The impact was loud. Bone and flesh crunched together as the guard's body snapped back from the sheer force of the blow. Sebastian, standing nearby, clenched his teeth in frustration. He had been counting on the guard to finish the boy. Furious at the failure, Sebastian made up his mind. Even if it cost him later, he would take matters into his own hands. He knew what others did not. Arthur's bond, one capable of forming an equal contract at such a young age, was no ordinary mana beast. It meant the beast would one day grow far beyond A-class. That power had to be his. Without hesitation, Sebastian began to cast a spell. Mana surged violently around him as he raised his staff, preparing to strike Arthur while the boy was still recovering from his counterattack. But then, everything changed. The air became still. Time itself seemed to halt. Everyone in the room froze, unsure of what was happening. Sebastian's spell never activated. He looked at his staff, confused and then panicked. There was no response, no fire, no energy, nothing. Arthur remained calm, standing within the silent chaos. A dark aura enveloped him, cloaking the space around his small frame in shadows. His eyes alone remained illuminated, glowing with a power unnatural and unshakable. It was not anger, it was control. It was something far more terrifying. Sebastian tried to hold his ground. He shouted defiantly, trying to remind everyone of his status as a royal conjurer. But the words didn't matter anymore. Arthur moved. In a single step, he was in front of Sebastian. Just as the mage was about to complete his fire spell, Arthur's leg came down like a hammer. A loud, raw crunch echoed through the hall as Sebastian's knee buckled inward. A sharp pain shot up Sebastian's leg, the force too much for the joint to endure. His scream ripped through the silence, his body collapsing under its own weight. He looked down in disbelief and horror. The mangled limb was his own. His knee was twisted at an impossible angle. The pain swallowed him. Sebastian screamed in agony, his voice cracking as pain overwhelmed him. He called out desperately, demanding help, but no one moved. No one responded to his cries. Arthur stood above him, his presence cold and unwavering. His eyes locked onto Sebastian's, unflinching and unreadable. His voice was calm but firm. There was no emotion, only clarity. He made it clear no one was coming. Sebastian's panic deepened. He tried to use his status, reminding everyone of his position as the royal conjurer, but it was useless. Arthur stared down at him with a gaze that pierced through every layer of pride and authority. He reminded Sebastian of his place, not just with words, but with overwhelming presence. In that moment, everything shifted again. The silence broke. The manna in the air stirred. Time, which had felt frozen, began to flow once more. King Blaine sat rigid, trying to understand what had just happened. His eyes shifted from his injured guard to the trembling form of Sebastian on the ground. His mind struggled to comprehend the scene. He wondered if perhaps the royal guard had simply stumbled or misstepped. Queen Priscilla didn't wait for explanations. Her voice cut through the air with urgency. She commanded her retainers. One was ordered to check Sebastian's condition. Another was sent to find an emitter to heal him. The atmosphere turned chaotic as they scrambled to respond to the queen's commands. Arthur, drained from the ordeal, finally collapsed. His small body gave in to the exhaustion and his eyes slowly shut. Reynolds rushed forward without hesitation, lifting his son gently into his arms. He held Arthur close, careful not to cause him any more pain. Alice, eyes red with tears, leaned down and tried to heal her son with her magic. Her hands glowed softly, trembling as she worked to mend the damage. As time passed, Arthur stirred. Pain pulsed through his head as he opened his eyes. The world was blurry, and his senses were slow to return. He turned his head carefully, first to the right, then to the left, trying to understand where he was. As his vision cleared, he recognized the room. It was his. He was safe in his own bed. Memories came flooding back. He remembered the confrontation, the overwhelming manna, the silence, the attack, then the black void. He recalled the moment he had used static void, the ability granted to him through Sylvia's dragon will. This technique, one that allowed him to separate himself from time itself, was powerful beyond reason. He had unlocked it after entering the acquire phase of Sylvia's legacy. It gave him control no one his age should ever possess, but it came at a price. Even with all of his training and preparation, he could only maintain static void for a few seconds. The backlash was brutal. His body couldn't handle more than that, and this time he had pushed beyond his limit. Worse still, it had been the first time he used the ability on another person. The toll was heavier than expected. Still, despite the risks, despite the pain, things had ended in his favor, and for now, that was enough. Alice finally opened the door. Her expression shifted from concern to surprise when she saw Arthur awake. She had expected him to still be unconscious, as the doctor had predicted, but there he was, alert and sitting up. Sylvie's concern immediately turned to relief as she rushed to Arthur's side. Alice moved closer, wrapping her arms around Arthur in a gentle hug. She spoke softly, a mix of relief and concern in her voice. The doctor had mentioned Arthur might wake soon after passing out, but 8 hours had passed, longer than anticipated. A sudden, sharp pain surged through Arthur's head. He winced, clutching his forehead briefly before trying to mask the discomfort. Alice's worry grew as she noticed his reaction. She asked if something was wrong. Arthur, forcing a small smile, assured her it was nothing. His mind, however, lingered on what had happened after he had lost consciousness. He asked her what had transpired since. Alice sighed, her voice growing softer as she explained. The situation had been chaotic, especially with the children. The king and his family had left shortly after, excusing themselves from the turmoil. She then mentioned that Reynolds was downstairs, discussing the events with the king's representative. Arthur, eager to find out more, decided to head downstairs and check on his father. He told Alice to rest and assured her that he was fine now. He then turned to Sylvie, telling her to go with Alice, to which Sylvie responded with a cheerful squeak. As Arthur made his way downstairs, he could hear his father's voice. The tone was heated, filled with frustration. Reynolds was adamant, explaining how the situation couldn't be solved with money. His words carried the weight of a father's anger at the danger his son had just faced. Arthur entered the living room, and Reynolds immediately spotted him. His father's relief was palpable as he rushed to his son, glad to see him awake and well. Arthur, brushing off any lingering discomfort, reassured him that he was fine. He then asked about the situation with the king's representative. Reynolds shook his head, frustration still evident in his voice. He explained that the king's representative had tossed a few gold coins onto the table, referring to them as a token of apology from the king, downplaying the seriousness of what had just happened. It was then Jasper Cog Wright, representing the king, greeted Arthur with a formal expression of condolences. Arthur, though still wary of the entire situation, thanked him for coming all the way to their home. Jasper was impressed by Arthur's composed demeanor. He explained that he had already shared most of the situation with Reynolds, but wanted Arthur to know as well. Both guards who had attacked him earlier had officially been relieved of their duties. Reynolds, still burning with anger, couldn't hold back. The idea that men who nearly killed his son would only lose their position seemed laughable to him. To Reynolds, this felt more like a mild slap on the wrist than actual punishment. Jasper responded with a sharp tone, reminding Reynolds that it had been Arthur who had first spoken out of turn before the king, a breach of royal etiquette. Arthur stepped between them, calming the rising heat. He acknowledged his own mistake, accepting that he had also crossed a line in front of royalty. He insisted they let the matter end there, assuring his father that he was unharmed. But Arthur had one more concern. He asked Jasper about the conjurer whose leg had been broken during the chaos. Jasper answered firmly. Sebastian had been stripped of his position, and his injury was now being treated by the royal healers. Arthur pressed further, wanting to know if anyone had figured out what caused the damage to Sebastian's leg. Jasper gave a measured response. After regaining consciousness, Sebastian had claimed that Arthur was responsible for the injury. Reynolds exploded at that, outraged at the accusation, but Jasper raised a hand, asking for patience. Though Sebastian insisted on Arthur's guilt, further examination of the mana traces on his staff suggested otherwise. The mana likely came from the first knight who had acted out, and it appeared to have interfered with Sebastian's own spell after ricocheting unexpectedly. Arthur kept his expression neutral, but a smile tugged at the edges of his mind. So this was how the entire incident would be swept away, excused by a convenient explanation of stray mana and poor spell control. With the conversation finished, Jasper turned and exited. On the table, a heavy pouch of gold coins remained, meant as compensation from the king. Arthur reached out and picked it up, turning to Reynolds. Reynolds looked at his son with a softer expression now. He reminded Arthur that he had come close to death, and that some form of compensation was only fair. Plus, Arthur would need the money when he began his journey as an adventurer. Arthur nodded in quiet appreciation, thanking his father genuinely. As Reynolds made his way toward the door, he paused and turned around. With a small grin, he held out his fist. Arthur, without hesitation, met it with his own. No words were spoken. None were needed. The bond between father and son, forged even stronger through fire, was clear in that simple gesture. Moments later, Arthur sat quietly, reflecting. He was relieved the situation had ended without further trouble, but the whole ordeal left a bitter aftertaste. It reminded him that in this world, no matter how strong his mind was, he was still just a child in the eyes of the powerful. But things would be different once he became an adventurer. With real strength, with experience, maybe then he could stop holding back. Maybe then he could let loose. The morning sun spilled through the windows of the modest inn, casting a warm glow across the table where Arthur sat with his parents and the Twin Horns party. Reynolds leaned back in his seat. With a serious but calm tone, he asked the important question. It was time to decide. Who would accompany Arthur on the journey? Adam leaned forward, his expression easygoing but honest. Though spoken lightheartedly, his refusal was firm. He joked that babysitting wasn't his strong point, and knowing his own bold nature, Arthur might just end up killing him in his sleep. Laughter broke out around the table, easing the tension. His sarcasm lifted the mood, but his answer remained unchanged. Reynolds turned his attention to Durden and Helen. He had been hoping one of them would step forward. With a humble tone, he explained that he and Alice didn't have much to offer, but they were more than willing to compensate for the help if someone took on the responsibility. Durden didn't let Reynolds finish that thought. He responded with sincerity, making it clear that money wasn't part of the equation. They were all family now. He spoke with warmth in his voice, expressing how much he'd love to accompany Arthur and be part of his growth. Helen nodded in agreement. She added that none of them were doing this for compensation. The treasure they had earned from their last dungeon raid was more than enough. This was about helping someone they cared for. But then, without warning, a calm voice broke through the moment. Jasmine's hand was raised. Everyone turned, confused. All eyes landed on her. Angela was the first to react. She couldn't hide her surprise, pointing out that Jasmine typically disliked escort missions even more than Adam. It was completely unlike her. But Jasmine's expression was steady. She gave a simple answer. This time, it was different, because it was Arthur. The table fell into silence for a moment. Then Helen, always the voice of logic, supported Jasmine's decision. She pointed out that, of everyone present, Jasmine was actually the most suitable choice. Durden's magic was designed for defending large parties with wide-range spells, not protecting a single individual. Helen herself admitted that personal protection wasn't her strength either. Alice looked to Jasmine, her concern still present. She needed to be sure. Jasmine simply responded with a confident thumbs up, her decision made. There was no hesitation in her eyes. Adam finally broke the silence, his tone casual but clear. He reminded everyone that Jasmine was the only augmenter among them who had an elemental affinity. She had advanced beyond the light orange stage just last year, and with her wind attribute, she was the most capable when it came to handling a long journey and possible danger. Her combat style, agility, and power made her the best fit to protect Arthur alone. Durden gave a slow nod. Though there was a hint of disappointment in his voice, he didn't argue. He He admitted that he would have liked to accompany Arthur himself, but realistically, sending more than one of them wasn't necessary. His magic was more suited to supporting groups, not guarding a single individual. It just didn't make sense. Reynolds offered Durden a few words of comfort, suggesting maybe next time they'd get a chance. Durden responded with a calm smile and thanked him. Arthur turned to Jasmine and spoke with respect. It was now settled. He would be under her care. The decision was final. In 1 week's time, Arthur would travel with Jasmine to the Adventurers Guild, where he would begin the first step toward becoming a registered adventurer. Later, when Arthur returned home with his family, he noticed Lilia in the living room, quietly sitting cross-legged on the floor, meditating with focused breaths. Before he could speak, Ellie rushed past him, her small feet padding quickly across the wooden floor. She dropped down beside Lilia, mimicking her position with determination on her face. She didn't want to be left behind. Arthur quietly observed. He realized that Lilia was now able to meditate on her own, even without needing him to imbue mana into her. It was progress. As for Ellie, he figured she might awaken at age 7 or 8 if she could sit still long enough to meditate seriously, but deep down, he thought maybe it was better if she didn't awaken too early. Attention wasn't always good. He didn't like the thought of the world focusing its gaze on his little sister just yet. Turning his attention to his father, Arthur brought up something he hadn't forgotten. He asked Reynolds if they could visit the auction house. He still hadn't picked out a sword and now felt like the right time. Reynolds, always supportive, agreed with a gentle smile. Alice, already on her way to the kitchen, reminded them not to stay out too long. She was about to start cooking dinner. Lilia's parents were already waiting when Arthur and Reynolds arrived at the Hellstay auction house. It was the first time Arthur had seen either of them since the confrontation with the royal guards. Their expressions immediately turned concerned the moment they laid eyes on him. A barrage of questions followed, all focused on Arthur's condition and whether he had truly recovered from the incident. Arthur did his best to reassure both Vincent and Tabitha, telling them he was okay and thankful the ordeal was behind him, but their eyes showed no ease. They were clearly frustrated, especially with how lightly the king had handled the matter. Vincent couldn't hold back his anger, openly expressing his belief that the dismissal of the two guards was just a temporary act to calm the situation. He was sure they'd be reinstated the moment attention faded. Reynolds, standing nearby, agreed. He had expected nothing less. Arthur then explained the purpose of their visit. He needed to find a sword before taking his application test at the Adventurers Guild. That snapped Vincent back into focus. He seemed to shake off his frustration as he led Arthur deeper into the storage area of the auction house. From her usual place on Arthur's head, Sylvie curiously scanned the large, cluttered storage hall. Boxes were stacked in barely organized piles. Shelves were lined with gear from merchants, adventurers, and even rare goods from distant lands, including the Dwarven Kingdom. The room was vast, and it hummed with the quiet energy of forgotten relics and untouched weapons. Arthur moved through the rows, scanning each shelf. He picked up a few swords one by one. His hands tested the weight, the balance, the grip, but none of them impressed him. Most of the blades were designed for adults, large, heavy, and shaped for augmenters who relied on brute strength over technique. Sword after sword was returned to its spot. The craftsmanship was dull, unrefined. Arthur grew more and more unimpressed. His current body was still small, so handling massive blades was out of the question. Yet everything around him seemed oversized or built with force rather than control in mind. It became clear why the shelves were filled with such weapons. In a world where most warriors used augmentation magic to boost their strength, two-handed swords and large one-handers dominated the market. But Arthur needed something sharper, quicker, something that fit him. His search for a sword he could truly rely on came up short. Frustration built quietly. For a moment, he even considered abandoning the idea of a traditional weapon altogether and seeking something more unique. Sylvie continued to trot across the dusty storage room, her nose twitching and her tail flicking with curiosity. Then she chirped, high-pitched and eager, and darted toward a cluttered pile of old weapons. She began digging with her front paws, scattering dust and rusty metal aside. Arthur followed her, brushing away the dusty haze that surrounded them as Sylvie kept pawing at something buried. She stopped suddenly, her paw resting on a plain black rod. It looked unimpressive, just a stick, completely out of place among swords, axes, and spears. Arthur crouched down and picked it up with a confused expression. The moment he held it, he realized something was off. It was surprisingly heavy, and the balance felt strange, not like a stick at all. It carried weight, presence, resistance. Then it hit him. It wasn't a rod. It was a sword, one sealed inside a sheath that completely masked its identity. He tried to unsheath the weapon, but it didn't budge. The blade was stuck tight. Arthur infused mana into it, focusing on each elemental attribute: fire, wind, water, earth, but nothing happened. The sword remained locked. He kept switching between elements, testing them all with careful precision, but the sheath refused to release the blade. Time passed. Frustration built. 30 minutes in, a different idea struck him. Maybe it wasn't just elemental mana. Maybe the key was something deeper. He focused inward and awakened Sylvia's dragon will. He didn't unleash its power, only allowed its presence to flow from him into the sword. The response was immediate. With just a light pull, the blade glided free from its sheath in absolute silence. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The weapon that emerged wasn't ordinary. It was beautiful, mesmerizing. The blade was a clear teal crystal that shimmered even in the dim room, casting a faint glow. The translucent color gave it an ethereal look, contrasted perfectly by the matte black scabbard and hilt. The sight of it held Arthur still, locked in awe. It was too elegant, too graceful to be considered a weapon made for killing, yet it radiated strength. He tested it, but the combined weight of the sword and sheath was still too much for his current body to handle. Despite the narrow blade, when he brought it down on an iron barrel nearby, it cleaved through with ease. The weapon wasn't just beautiful, it was deadly. As Arthur examined the hilt more closely, he spotted a small engraving just above the grip. Dawn's Ballad WK4. He whispered the name. The moment the name passed his lips, a sharp pain ripped through his palm. He cried out and dropped the sword. A fresh gash ran across his hand, but it had already been seared closed, cauterized as if by magic. Hesitant, he picked the sword back up. This time he noticed something different. The sword had changed. It no longer felt too heavy. The balance was perfect. The weight adjusted as if the weapon had recalibrated itself. Even the grip seemed smaller, reshaped to fit perfectly into his young hand. It was as if the blade had accepted him, as if it had chosen him. Arthur tested it again, moving it through the air. It was flawless. Arthur stood in silence, still holding the sword that now felt like an extension of himself. He had held countless blades in his past life, rare, priceless weapons crafted by the best artificers, but nothing, not even the finest swords from royal vaults or ancient relic chambers, had ever matched him this perfectly. With a sudden burst of motion, Arthur dashed forward and slashed through a nearby barrel. The blade sliced clean through it, effortless, precise. The cut was smooth, almost surgical. It was as if the weapon responded before his muscles even fully committed to the motion. Such weapons were known to exist in extremely rare cases. In ancient records, there were mentions of master artificers crafting staves and wands that could bond with a single user. Those weapons would adapt, allowing the wielder to channel mana more efficiently through a unique synchronization. But never had Arthur read or heard of a sword that could do the same. Never a sword that could bind itself so completely to one person. His eyes returned to the inscription on the blade. Dawn's Ballad WK4. The initials stayed in his mind. Who was WK the Fourth? How had this mysterious figure created something so advanced, so personal, and so perfectly forged? Arthur stood in awe until the voice of Reynolds broke the silence, reminding him that too much time had passed in the storage hall. Snapping out of his thoughts, Arthur quickly grabbed a smaller sword. An excuse, a cover. He didn't want anyone else to pay too much attention to what he had just discovered. He held up the smaller blade and mentioned it casually, saying it would be enough. It wasn't as flashy or elegant as the others, but he claimed it grew on him after a few swings. Reynolds smiled, relieved his son had found something, and turned to Vincent with curiosity. Vincent explained that the sword Arthur picked had actually been placed in one of the smaller auction stalls multiple times, but no one had shown interest in it. Reynolds looked surprised. He took the sword from Arthur's hands, unsheathed it, and gave it a few test swings. The motion was careful, deliberate. Reynolds studied the smaller sword carefully, testing its weight and feel in his hand. He noticed that the balance was slightly off, clearly the result of an attempt to lighten the weapon's frame. Yet for someone of Arthur's size, it would actually work well. It was light enough for a growing body to handle, and sturdy enough for basic training and early battles. His attention then shifted to the black rod Arthur was still holding. Curious, he asked what it was. Arthur remained calm on the outside, masking his inner excitement. He claimed he had stumbled over it on the way back and found it heavy and strong enough to be a decent training stick. Vincent glanced at the rod. His curiosity piqued. It didn't seem familiar to him, so he requested a closer look. Arthur handed it over casually. Vincent turned it in his hands, frowning in thought before calling over his assistant, Jameson, to ask if there were any records of the object. Jameson quickly recalled the item. He explained that one of their merchants had once received the rod from an old man who muttered about no one being worthy before throwing it at him. Despite the strange origin, multiple inspectors had examined it and found nothing magical or valuable, just a strong cane. Still, Jameson suggested that perhaps a more advanced artificer might be able to discover something others had missed. Arthur apologized politely, saying he hadn't meant to take something valuable, but Vincent brushed it off immediately, assuring him it was fine. The item had been lying around gathering dust, and if Arthur wanted it, he should keep it. Arthur thanked Vincent with a cheerful smile, calling him uncle as he accepted the rod. Inside, Arthur was thrilled. He had pulled it off. The mysterious sword, now disguised as a simple training tool, was his. Later, the celebration began. The entire Helsty estate had been decorated beautifully with festive ornaments and colorful threads. Both the Twin Horns and the Helsty thrifty family had gathered, along with Arthur's own family, to celebrate his 9th birthday. When everyone shouted their wishes together, Arthur stepped forward and gave a respectful bow, thanking them all for being part of his life for another year. Alice looked at Arthur warmly, struggling to believe how quickly time had passed. Her son was already 9. The thought brought a mix of pride and nostalgia to her heart, but before she could get too sentimental, Vincent clapped his hands and cheerfully reminded her that there would be time for reminiscing after the celebration. The Hellstay mansion was alive with vibrant energy. Laughter echoed through the grand halls, mingling with the sound of wine glasses clinking and the constant motion of maids and butlers tending to the guests. The room was filled with light and joy. Tabitha, never one to hold back, encouraged everyone to dig in, reminding them that this wasn't a museum. Her playful scolding set the tone for the lively dinner. At the table, the atmosphere was casual and filled with cheer. Adam became the center of attention as he launched into one of his loud, exaggerated stories. He brought up an embarrassing memory of Durden, his pants catching fire, forcing him to walk back into town trying to hide his exposed backside. The story had the group in stitches. Durden flushed with embarrassment, trying to laugh it off. But the teasing didn't stop there. Jasmine jumped in with her own jab at Adam, reminding him of the time a horned mole crept up on him while he was relieving himself in a dungeon. Adam tried to deflect by recalling how Jasmine had screamed so loud that she fell flat on her back, accidentally urinating on herself in fear. The entire table erupted into loud, uncontrolled laughter. These were the kind of stories that bonded them, ridiculous, real, and unforgettable. After the meal, everyone gathered in the living room. The fireplace crackled warmly, filling the space with a cozy, smoky scent. The glow of the flames gave the room a comforting, golden hue as the birthday celebration continued. Reynolds stepped forward, presenting Arthur with a wrapped gift from both himself and Alice. Ellie eagerly chimed in, reminding everyone that the present was from her as well. Arthur invited his little sister to open it with him, and she nodded excitedly. Together, they unwrapped the gift. Inside was a single fingerless glove designed to fit Arthur's left hand. The craftsmanship was impressive. The leather had been taken from a spiked auroch, an animal Reynolds had hunted and skinned with his own hands. Embedded into the glove were 3 small gems. Alice explained that each gem contained a minor healing spell. Though the spells could only be used once, they were meant to provide some emergency protection for Arthur when he began venturing out on missions. Arthur wrapped his arms around both of his parents, filled with gratitude. He loved the gift, not just for its practicality, but for the thought and effort they had put into it. Vincent cleared his throat with a grand gesture, drawing everyone's attention. He called Arthur's name with a flourish, then theatrically dropped to one knee, holding out a small, elegant box. When he opened it, inside were 2 silver rings, one simple and smooth, the other adorned with a clear gem that caught the light. Arthur stared, confused about where this performance was heading. Tabitha rolled her eyes and playfully smacked Vincent's shoulder, scolding him for teasing. The room chuckled at the harmless act. Vincent laughed, admitting defeat, then shifted to a more sincere tone. The simple ring was meant for Arthur, while the ring with the gem was meant for Alice. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a mana-linked pair. As long as Arthur wore his ring, the gem in Alice's ring would glow if his mana levels dropped to a dangerously low point. Though it couldn't offer any other aid beyond that warning, it was created to give his mother some peace of mind. Alice was deeply moved. She stood and wrapped her arms around Tabitha, her voice trembling with gratitude as she thanked the Hellstay family for such a thoughtful gift. Arthur observed the emotional moment, understanding the purpose behind the ring. To him, it felt like a double-edged sword. It might ease his family's constant fear for his safety, but it could also leave his mother living in dread, always bracing for that gem to glow. After a quiet moment, Adam stood, trying to bring some energy back into the room. He admitted it would be tough to top such a heartfelt gift, but the twin horns had also prepared something. Knowing how strong Arthur already was, they figured he didn't need weapons or armor, so instead they brought something for the whole family's peace of mind. Durden presented the gift, 2 scrolls. These weren't ordinary scrolls, but rare sound transmission scrolls. Adam, ever the loud one, proudly explained how Arthur could infuse mana into his scroll to record a message. That message would then reach the paired scroll, which Alice would keep. She could then send a reply, and once the reply was heard, both scrolls would burn away into ash, used only once, but powerful in their purpose. Jasmine interrupted Adam's over-the-top bragging by smacking the back of his head, cutting short his dramatic explanation. Adam coughed and finished with a bow, keeping the mood light. Arthur was grateful for the gift, another tether to his family, even when miles apart. Later in the evening, Reynolds pulled Arthur aside for a quiet moment. With a firm but proud tone, he reminded his son that tomorrow would be the big day, the start of something greater. Alice followed up with a heartfelt plea, asking Arthur to always prioritize his safety. It didn't matter how powerful he became or how much wealth he earned. She only wanted her son to come home safe. Arthur nodded, promising them both. He assured his parents that he would be careful and and that he'd return home whenever he had the chance. After the celebration, Arthur's parents' former party members left to return to their inn. The Helsty family also retired upstairs as Lilia, exhausted from the day, began to doze off. This left Arthur alone with his parents. They spent some time discussing his future, the dangers that came with being an adventurer, and the path he was about to embark on. Eventually, his parents ushered him back to his room, where he could finally rest. Lying in bed, Arthur felt a strong sense of realization. He had known it for a while, but as sleep began to take him, the feeling truly sank in. He had a family now, people who loved him. This was a feeling he never wanted to lose. He would protect it, fight for it if necessary. To do so, he knew he had to better himself. His goal now was more than just strength. He needed to surpass even the power he had once wielded as a king. The next morning, Arthur dressed simply in a shirt and pants, taking a final look around the room where he had spent the past few months. He mentally imprinted the sight of the room into his memory, knowing it would be a long time before he would be back. He put on his glove and ring, packed his coat and mask, along with other essential items into his bag. Then, securing both Dawn's ballad and his short sword to his waist, he prepared to leave. Reynolds gave him a proud but cautious look. He acknowledged Arthur's strength but reminded him to never get cocky. Knowing his son was strong, Reynolds also advised him to trust in Jasmine when things became difficult. Arthur reassured him with a promise, then made his way toward the door. But before he could leave, Ellie appeared, clutching his waist, not yet ready to let go. She had just realized that Arthur wouldn't be home for a while. Her small body pressed against him, refusing to release her hold. Arthur's mother, Alice, tried to calm her, but Ellie's tear-filled eyes were full of distress. She sobbed, demanding that Arthur stay. Arthur kneeled down to her level, wrapping her in a tight hug. He gently asked her to look after their parents while he was gone. Ellie, after a few moments of sobbing, finally responded, her voice muffled as she promised she could protect them. She buried her face in his shoulder, unwilling to let go. Arthur knew that his time with her had been short, but this step was necessary for him to protect all of them in the long run. Alice embraced him tightly. Reynolds echoed the sentiment, assuring Arthur that they would all be fine. Alice reminded him not to forget the ring, a small but important reminder of their connection and the safety it provided. Arthur smiled, reassuring her that he wouldn't forget. Reynolds spoke one last time, his voice firm yet full of love, telling Arthur that they would always be rooting for him. With the goodbyes complete, Arthur made his way down the stairs where Jasmine was waiting for him. He donned his mask and coat, his demeanor shifting to that of a prepared adventurer. With a steady voice, he declared that they were ready to go. Jasmine, as always, gave a curt nod in response, and together, they headed toward the Adventurers Guild Hall. The guild hall was nothing like Arthur had expected. He had imagined a rough and rowdy place with thugs sitting around wooden tables, drinking and shouting. Instead, the building before him was one of prestige and luxury. A towering marble structure rose high, more like a sacred museum than a typical guild hall. Jasmine, walking beside Arthur, seemed to notice something off. She observed his bond, Sylvie, and remarked that her form looked different. Arthur explained that he had recently discovered Sylvie could alter her appearance slightly. By changing into a form resembling a black lizard, she became less noticeable and easier to conceal. Inside the guild hall, they were greeted by a receptionist whose smile was practiced, almost too perfect. She welcomed them with the same rehearsed enthusiasm she would any adventurer, asking how she could assist them. Before Arthur could respond, Jasmine slid a piece of parchment toward the woman, indicating her intent to sponsor Arthur for a rank examination. Her face remained emotionless, showing no sign of concern or excitement. The receptionist's tone shifted once she saw the parchment. She quickly became accommodating, offering to move Arthur to the front of the queue. It seemed that with a sponsor, Arthur wouldn't have to wait as long as others. She gestured for them to follow her, and they did without delay. As they entered, the sounds of hushed conversations filled the air. Arthur could hear whispers among the people present. Some speculated about the rank examination, while others mockingly commented on the pair's appearance. The murmurs seemed to focus on Jasmine and Arthur, especially the fact that he was wearing a mask, with one voice even referring to him as a masked midget. Jasmine, unfazed by the comments, urged Arthur to keep moving. Without a word, he followed the clerk as they made their way further into the guild hall. Arthur and Jasmine walked into the office where the branch in charge awaited them. The clerk, standing by the door, announced their arrival, mentioning that Jasmine Flamesworth had requested the rank examination for Arthur. The in charge, Caspian Bladeheart, a man of authority and distinction, seemed quite familiar with Jasmine. He had recently met with her father and greeted her warmly. Jasmine gave a brief glance toward Caspian, acknowledging his voice but saying little. Caspian, with a smile, introduced himself to Arthur. He explained the usual usual process for rank examinations, filling out an application, inspecting the mana core, and performing practical exams. However, since Jasmine was sponsoring Arthur, Caspian decided to waive those steps. Arthur wondered inwardly about Jasmine's family, who seemed to carry significant weight, especially in a place like this. The thought of Flamesworth stirred curiosity in him. Caspian, continuing with his explanation, stated that the only remaining task for Arthur was a mock duel against one of the examiners. Given Arthur's weapons, Caspian assumed he was either a fighter or an augmenter, but he had no intention of asking for Arthur's name. Adventurers didn't need to provide one when registering, but because of his close ties to Jasmine, Caspian thought it polite to ask. Extending his hand, Caspian asked how he should address Arthur. Arthur felt the tension in the air as he shook his hand. The sensation electric. There was a mutual understanding between them in that moment, each recognizing strength in the other. Arthur, wearing his mask, offered a simple response. He went by Note. Caspian accepted the name without hesitation and remarked that it was a pleasure meeting him. He then instructed Mary, the clerk, to guide Arthur to the examination hall. As Mary led them down a long corridor, Arthur glanced at Jasmine, his curiosity growing. Was this the real reason she had insisted on accompanying him? Her family, the Flamesworth house, was respected, but how much influence did they truly have? Arthur was still piecing it together. At the end of the corridor, the receptionist directed them to a staircase that led directly to the testing area. The receptionist reminded them to go up the stairs and remain seated until their name was called. Arthur squinted as his eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness when they stepped out of the dark passageway. The blinding light slowly faded, and he could make out the details of the hall. It was an indoor arena, the ground covered with dirt, and rows of theater-style seats surrounding the area. The scene in front of him unfolded as a large, bald man with a polearm was engaged in a battle with a smaller, more agile opponent. The bald man roared in frustration, swinging his polearm with all his strength, but it was clear that he was at a disadvantage. His opponent, with short black hair and a jagged scar running down his cheek, moved with precision, easily dodging the bald man's wide, reckless swings. The scarred fighter displayed an apathetic expression, his demeanor similar to Jasmine's. He didn't even bother to draw his broadsword, instead using his agility to avoid the bald man's heavy attacks with ease. The bald man shouted a battle cry, launching a wide swing, but the sound of metal meeting metal rang through the arena as his polearm was deflected and sent spinning high into the air. The audience could easily see who had won the exchange. The bald man was left stunned, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The examiner, observing the situation, was quick to offer his assessment. He criticized the bald man for relying too much on physical strength rather than proper mana reinforcement. His attacks lacked balance and were predictably easy to counter. Despite his age and training, the bald man had only reached the dark orange stage of mana proficiency, far below the expected standard. In response to the bald man's sobs, the examiner shook his head and slapped a tag onto his forehead, declaring him fit for a D-class ranking, a step below what he had hoped for. The bald man, defeated, muttered his disappointment. The announcement echoed through the arena. Next, Diane Whitehall, a young woman appearing to be in her teens, quickly stood up. As she rushed to the center, her nervousness caused her to trip, bumping into the stairs and stumbling down to the floor in a heap. The audience erupted in laughter, the sound of snickers and giggles spreading like wildfire. Some mocked her clumsy fall, calling out comments about her wardrobe, further fueling the laughter. Arthur's attention was drawn to a group of examinees as a voice echoed through the arena. A boy, clearly unimpressed, mockingly shook his head, dismissing the freckled girl who had just stumbled. Diane Whitehall, the young woman who had just embarrassed herself earlier, stood up. Arthur noted her age, 18, and her status as a conjurer at the solid orange stage with a specialization in water magic. A woman examiner addressed her. "No need to introduce yourself, dear. We already have your information." Arthur's mind took in the details as the examiner explained the expectations for conjurers who had reached the orange stage. It was common knowledge that conjurers, once they hit that level, usually focused on their highest affinity element rather than spreading themselves thin with all four. Dual specialization was rare and came with tougher tests to ensure the applicant's true mastery over their elements. The examiner gestured for Diane to begin. Diane, without hesitation, murmured a spell, summoning a bubble of water to surround her. It was a basic defense tactic for conjurers, as they typically lacked the ability to reinforce their bodies with mana like other classes. The examiner, however, had no intention of giving Diane an easy time. She called out a spell, Sandstorm, and instantly a fierce gust of wind whipped sand into the air, enveloping Diane's water bubble. The sand cloud obscured the girl's vision, testing her ability to handle an offensive challenge. Arthur observed closely, noting the strategic use of the spell. It wasn't just about blocking, it was about disrupting the conjurer's concentration, forcing her to act. Diane, unfazed, took a step back and muttered another incantation. A ball of water began to form at the tip of her wand, building pressure. Then, with a quick motion, she released the ball, sending it flying towards the examiner with incredible incredible speed, but the examiner was prepared. With a swift movement, she dodged the water sphere, allowing it to whiz past her. The moment Diane saw her spell fail, she quickly adapted, shouting, "Burst!" as she swung her wand downward. The condensed water exploded, creating a cloud of mist that engulfed the arena. For a brief moment, the examiner vanished from view. The audience held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The noble who had mocked Diane earlier was now shaking his head, clearly unimpressed with her efforts. But the mist began to clear, revealing that the examiner had vanished and reappeared behind Diane. Without warning, she tapped the top of the girl's head lightly with her staff, a clear sign that the test was over. The examiner's voice echoed through the arena, assessing Diane's performance with a professional tone. Her control over her magic was noted as decent, and the examiner acknowledged the well-practiced spell chain. However, she pointed out the lack of a secondary defensive measure, deeming Diane's overconfidence a flaw. Despite this, the examiner recognized her mana control and cast speed, assigning her a C-class rank. Arthur observed the assessment, and though Diane's confidence may have faltered in one aspect, he found that a C-class rank at her age was still impressive, something to be proud of in this competitive environment. The announcement of the next contestant cut his thoughts short. Elijah Knight. The clerk moved to the examiner, whispering and presenting some notes. After a brief moment, the examiner made a swift decision. Elijah was granted a B-class rank without having to take the test. His status was already established, and the examiner recognized his strength without question. The other examinees exchanged surprised glances. It was unheard of for someone to be given such a high rank without being tested. Arthur too was intrigued. His mind raced, wondering who Elijah Knight was to receive such a privilege. Next was Lucas Wykes. The young boy, barely more than a child, stood lazily from his seat. His posture spoke of an overconfident attitude, a sense of entitlement that made it clear he was used to being in control. He made no effort to show any formal respect, and instead leaned against his staff with an air of boredom. His age and relaxed demeanor did little to hide the power that was about to be displayed. At just 11 years old, Lucas was already at the light orange stage in conjuring, with a single specialization in fire. The examiner, though clearly irritated by his lack of respect, prepared to begin. The boy moved casually, beginning a chant as if he were unfazed by the entire process. Without warning, a massive pillar of flames erupted in front of Lucas. It grew rapidly, taking the form of a humanoid figure made entirely of fire, standing over 6 feet tall. Onlookers, including an augmenter from the sidelines, could not help but be impressed. The Wykes family's reputation was further solidified in that moment, as Lucas demonstrated a mastery of fire magic that was rarely seen, even among those much older than him. The Flame Guardian, summoned by Lucas, sprinted toward the examiner, leaving behind a trail of smoldering footprints. As the fiery construct closed in, Lucas began chanting another spell, his smirk widening with the promise of more destruction to come. The examiner watched, impressed by the young boy's skill and his ability to control such powerful magic. She acknowledged that Lucas's talent was genuine, but she also noted his disrespect, a flaw she would not overlook. With a swift motion of her gray staff and a few words to ignite her spell, she cast Earth Tomb. The ground beneath the Flame Guardian erupted as 3 triangular planes of solid earth shot up, trapping the fiery construct in a pyramid of rock. Arthur watched closely, recognizing the examiner's strategy. The Flame Guardian would soon be extinguished, as it would run out of oxygen within the enclosed space, making it a clever and effective tactic. However, Lucas merely chuckled at the examiner's move, continuing his chant with confidence. He had no doubt that his next spell would turn the situation to his advantage. His eyes gleamed with arrogance as he completed his chant, ready to show the examiner just how outclassed she was. Lucas was not afraid. Despite the examiner's growing frustration, the ruby stone in his staff suddenly gleamed with an intense orange glow, and a spark burst into the air. The spark exploded, generating dozens of small tendrils of fire that floated around the arena, surrounding the 2 combatants. The flames danced ominously in the air, a clear sign that Lucas was ready to escalate the fight. With a swift motion, Lucas dashed backward, raising his staff above his head. He shouted the incantation for expulsion, and the fire tendrils flared a bright red before shooting beams of intense flame directly at the examiner. The air crackled with heat as the fiery projectiles raced toward their target. The examiner, however, remained calm. She aimed her staff at the ground beneath her, continuing her chant without hesitation. The surface below her began to glow bright yellow as multiple pieces of earth shot up from the ground, rising quickly to form a defensive barrier. But the examiner's defense wasn't just to block the incoming flames. She turned the attack back toward Lucas. The beams of fire, redirected by the earth, shot back toward him. Desperation filled Lucas's face as he yelled, "Release!" The flames that had been aimed at the examiner were now coming at him, and he quickly dropped to the ground in an attempt to evade the blast. The earth shards around him, however, acted as his shield, blocking the flames and protecting him from harm. The examiner raised her voice with a calm, firm firm tone, addressing Lucas Wykes. She acknowledged the boy's raw mana pool and the impressive ability to cast high-tier fire affinity spells. His potential was undeniable, but there was more that needed to be said about his behavior and control. Before she could finish her statement, Lucas snapped back, unwilling to accept any form of critique. Anger flashing in his eyes, he refused to let the duel end on those terms. He raised his oversized staff once again and cast another spell, determined to prove his superiority. Multiple flaming trails were still lingering in the arena, and now a fiery cyclone erupted around him, tightly coiled but surging with heat, just large enough to encase his figure in blazing protection. Before Lucas could launch another offensive spell, George suddenly intervened. He unsheathed his sword and stepped in front of Lucas, blocking him from making any further moves. The air grew tense as George firmly reminded him that it was Lucas who had violated the rules of the examination by initiating an additional attack after the test had already concluded. Lucas, consumed with rage, yelled out in frustration, blaming the examiner for interrupting his next move. He claimed she had ended the match prematurely, blocking his fire beams when he had everything under control. George remained composed, ignoring Lucas's fury, and asked Emily, the examiner, to finalize and announce the results of the evaluation. Emily maintained her professional tone. She reiterated that Lucas had displayed excellent mana control and a powerful mana pool. Despite his flaws in composure and the recklessness caused by inexperience, his raw ability was more than enough to qualify him for B class. Lucas, gutted by the decision, stormed off in frustration. His pride had taken a blow, and the B class rank, which he believed to be beneath him, felt like an insult. A bald man nearby tried to lift Lucas's spirits by congratulating him. He offered a friendly remark, praising Lucas for a good performance and for achieving B class. But Lucas wasn't interested in encouragement. Fury surged through him as he lashed out, hurling insults at the others around him. He shouted that B class was a mere formality, something he had expected all along, and he refused to be compared to what he called babbling fools. Lucas sat back down, seething with resentment. Bitterness burned in his expression as he muttered under his breath, clinging to the hope that his father would hear of the incident and right what he considered a grave injustice. The clerk's voice echoed across the hall, announcing the next examinee. Note: as Arthur stepped forward, Jasmine gave him a quiet glance of encouragement, a subtle gesture of support before the match. Walking towards the arena, Arthur calmly analyzed his upcoming opponent. His thoughts ran sharp and focused. The examiner was clearly a skilled warrior, years of training reflected in every step he took. His swordsmanship was sharp and explosive, but Arthur noted the small flaws, the brief openings in the man's stance. They were small, but enough. George, the swordsman and current examiner, grew impatient and barked at Arthur to hurry. His tone was sharp, noting that there was no prior record or profile available for the masked youth now standing before him. He tried to peer through the slit of Arthur's mask, curious about the mysterious examinee. With a swift motion, George unsheathed his blade. Arthur mirrored the action, drawing his short sword with ease. But as Arthur advanced, something shifted. George froze for a moment. A pressure unlike anything he'd expected weighed down on him. His hands trembled faintly. The calm air around the arena had grown heavy, thick with unseen tension. Something about the masked boy triggered a deep, primal fear. Before the spar could begin, a firm voice cut through the moment. Caspian, an authoritative figure among the adventurers, ordered George to stand down. The atmosphere shifted again, this time with a sense of awe. George turned to him, surprised. He questioned the decision, unsure why someone of Caspian's level, an AA class adventurer no less, would involve himself in a basic examination, especially when Caspian was a renowned mage, one whose talents far exceeded the current situation. But Caspian made his intent clear. It had nothing to do with George's hesitation. It was a matter of personal duty. The masked boy had a sponsor, someone Caspian respected, and because of that connection, Caspian would test him himself. With that, George stepped back, and the crowd fell into a hush. Now, only Arthur and Caspian stood in the center of the dirt-floored arena. Caspian took position without delay. The surrounding adventurers and observers watched closely, their eyes locked on the unusual scene unfolding before them. Arthur raised his short sword just above his waist, his stance calm but prepared, equally ready to attack or defend. As the noise around him faded into silence, his attention narrowed fully onto Caspian. The man in front of him wasn't just an examiner. He was the head of one of the largest guild halls in Sapin and an elite adventurer of the highest caliber. Caspian carried no visible flaws in his posture. His aura radiated overwhelming pressure, sharp and suffocating. This wasn't going to be a routine test. Caspian's presence made it clear. He intended to push Arthur to the limit, and yet Arthur felt something stir within him, a sense of excitement. A grin formed inwardly. Even as tension crackled through the air, his anticipation only grew. Caspian gave a brief warning to prepare, making it clear that the special attention Arthur was receiving should not be misunderstood. Arthur simply nodded, calm and collected. Without wasting a second, Caspian surged forward. His boots tore through the dust, thrust, and he closed the distance in a heartbeat. His rapier lunged forward like a striking snake. Arthur tilted his head just in time, but the blade was so fast it still sliced off a few strands of his hair, leaving them floating to the ground. The speed was unreal. The next strike came down hard, and Arthur reacted instantly. He ducked, twisting his body in an acrobatic motion as the rapier cut through air where he had just stood. Caspian shifted his stance and charged again, relentless in his pursuit. Arthur had no time to think, as Caspian came in with full confidence, stomping the ground and thrusting his rapier with full force. Arthur slipped beneath his arm and pushed him to the side. The move caught Caspian off guard. For a brief moment, he stood stunned, impressed by the speed, the reaction, and the agility of this young swordsman. Drawing his rapier back, Caspian launched another attack, lunging at an angle. Arthur raised his scabbard to block. The clash of metal rang sharply through the arena. Arthur retaliated with a quick slash of his sword, but Caspian was a master of movement. He bent his body and stepped back, barely avoiding the blade. Seizing the opportunity, Caspian lashed out again, this time with a forward stab. The tip of his rapier sliced past Arthur's ear, leaving behind a small cut and drawing first blood. Arthur instinctively slashed backward to counter, but Caspian was already gone, vanishing behind him with fluid footwork. Before Arthur could react, Caspian struck again, a blunt jab with the back of his rapier to Arthur's spine. The hit knocked Arthur off balance and sent him stumbling forward. As the fight went on, the differences between them became painfully clear. Arthur's body was still young, smaller and less developed than what he once wielded in his prime. His muscles lacked maturity, and his frame was over a foot shorter than the height he had been used to in his past life. Even though his physique had been hardened by the remnants of Sylvia's dragon will, it was no match for a seasoned fighter like Caspian, whose body was enhanced and fortified with dense mana. All his training and instincts screamed within him, but adapting to this young, unfamiliar body was still a challenge. Only a few seconds had passed in their violent exchange, yet both Arthur and Caspian emerged with nothing more than shallow injuries. But the air between them had changed. Caspian's calm voice no longer matched his expression. His gaze had sharpened. The seriousness that now cloaked him was undeniable. Whatever amusement he once held was gone. A cold shiver climbed Arthur's spine. The hairs on his neck stood on end. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't an exam anymore. Caspian's last strike had been aimed straight at his heart. Whether it was intentional or a test, the message was clear. This had become a real fight. Caspian acknowledged Arthur's potential. Even he now saw that Jasmine Flamesworth had brought in someone valuable. As the AA class veteran prepared his next strike, a shift of mana energy began to build around him. Arthur immediately read the signs. Two sharp thrusts followed, but this time Arthur anticipated them. The attacks weren't simple stabs. They carried invisible wind bullets, deadly projectiles almost too fast to see, but Arthur had observed them once before and now recognized the rhythm. The path was straight. Speed was a threat, but not unpredictability. Arthur dropped low, ducking beneath the first wind projectile. That one move closed the gap. Mana surged through his body and focused into his free hand. As he slid his fingers down the blade of his sword, the steel ignited in red-hot flames. He didn't hesitate. With fire licking across the blade, he swung down, releasing a blazing arc directly at Caspian. Caspian reacted fast. His rapier met the strike mid-air, and the clash sent out a wave of heat and pressure. Explosions burst at the point of contact, streaks of fire blooming with every hit. Their blades collided again and again, both fighters locked in a heated rhythm. Sparks and flame danced violently between them. Through the fury of attacks, Caspian's eyes caught something unexpected in Arthur's. There was fear, but not the kind that made one weak. It was the kind that sharpened survival, that pushed limits. Caspian grinned unconsciously, but sweat was already dripping from his brow. A thought clawed at the back of his mind. He was an AA-class adventurer, wielding techniques most augmenters could only dream of. He had ranged attacks, control, and power. The outcome should have been predictable, yet despite everything, his heart beat faster. His grip tightened. For the first time in a long while, doubt crept in. He was nervous, and that terrified him more than anything. He caught himself. This wasn't the time to get overconfident. Without hesitation, Caspian fired more sharp bullets of wind. Arthur darted across the arena, weaving through the deadly projectiles. On the sidelines, Jasmine Flamesworth rose to her feet. She could feel the intensity in the air. Her concern was visible now. This had gone too far. Arthur's eyes narrowed as he watched Caspian concentrate. The Guildhall manager focused mana into his rapier again. The blade shimmered with a silvery white glow. With a wide, powerful swing, Caspian cleared the flames around him, just enough to create a tiny window. It wasn't much, but Arthur saw it. It was enough. Mana surged into Arthur's left foot. He shaped it instinctively into a movement spell. Piston stamp. Flames exploded beneath his soul. The burst launched him like a missile, hurling his body forward at full speed. He shot through the air, closing the distance until he landed beside beside Caspian. The landing wasn't perfect. He had overshot by a foot, but he adjusted quickly. There was no time to form a proper spell. Arthur simply reinforced his body with mana and thrust his sword forward, aiming for an opening. But Caspian was ready. Just as Arthur's blade came within reach, the last words of a spell left Caspian's lips. The air cracked open. A whirlwind erupted from his body. It was Gale's vortex. The protective twister burst into form, forcing Arthur to pull back instantly. The air spun violently. Wind howled around Caspian. Then the storm shifted. Caspian launched into his own attack. His rapier became a blur. The sheer number of thrusts turned invisible, too fast to track. Arthur had no time to wonder anymore. This wasn't a test. Caspian was fighting with the intent to win, or worse. Arthur exploded forward again, slipping past the gusts of wind. He reached Caspian and caught hold of his rapier-wielding hand. The sudden grab stunned Caspian. Arthur pulled himself closer with explosive force. His final strike was ready. He was just inches away. It could have ended here, but Caspian's instincts howled in panic. Fear took hold. For a moment, the impossible felt real. Inside, Caspian asked himself what he had never thought possible. Was he about to lose? That fear erupted outward. The vortex of air burst like a storm let loose. A violent blast of air and mana flooded the entire arena. The shockwave sent onlookers stumbling, chairs scraping across the floor. Wind roared in every direction. Visibility was completely lost in the storm. Arthur crashed back, forced to drag himself to a stop through the dirt and dust. His boots carved trenches into the arena floor. The force had blown him far. As the dust settled, he glared forward, locking eyes with his opponent. A space widened between them. Both fighters stood their ground. Caspian panted heavily, sweat clinging to his brow. His shoulders rose and fell with exhaustion. On the edge of the field, Jasmine's grip tightened. She drew her blade, stepping forward in readiness. Arthur clenched his jaw. He had reached his limit. With a final push, he called upon the last remnants of mana inside him and concentrated it deep within his body. The spell took form, Thunderclap Impulse. It was a high-risk lightning spell rarely used due to its complexity and minimal increase in power, but Arthur believed differently. There were two paths in lightning magic, external and internal. Most mages only studied the external kind, safer and easier to control, but Arthur focused on the internal path. The books warned it was dangerous and not worth the gain. He disagreed. He believed that with his enhanced speed and reflexes, he could make it work. Even now, he hoped it would be enough to dodge what was coming next. Electric currents surged through Arthur's limbs. As he dashed forward, the hairs on his skin stood up. The air bullets sliced through the arena, whispering death, but Arthur was ready to avoid them. He could feel them, every subtle shift in the air. Then, just as the storm reached its height, it all stopped. The barrage of air bullets faded into nothing. The spell dissolved into harmless wind, brushing across Arthur's face. The sudden absence of danger was jarring. Caspian lowered his rapier and quietly sheathed it. His body relaxed. The tension drained from the arena. Arthur released his own spell. The lightning along his limbs faded. His muscles trembled from the strain, but he held steady. His breath was heavy, but controlled. Caspian turned his back and began walking toward the exit. His voice was calm again. He had seen enough. He acknowledged Arthur's hidden strength. Arthur had held back his full abilities until the very end, clearly intending to stay under the radar. Caspian had recognized that choice. He made his judgment swiftly, B-class. Just before vanishing into the dark corridor beyond the arena, Caspian glanced back. One lens of his glasses was cracked, a clear mark of how close Arthur had come. Their eyes met for a brief second, and then the Guildhall manager was gone. Arthur said nothing. He only nodded. The fight was over. The Augmenter Examiner raised his voice across the arena, announcing the end of the evaluation. The rest of the staff followed after Caspian in a hurry. The dust still floated in the air, dancing in the fading tension. Arthur remained rooted to the spot. He had come not to impress, but to endure. And this was just the beginning. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.